What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Please be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you end up enjoying this video, doing any of those helps the video to do well and the channel to do well, and ensures I can continue making this content daily for many years to come. If you guys have any thoughts about the video, please be sure to share them in the comments below, as I always read all of them, even if I don't always get the chance to respond to them all. Last but not least, if you guys would like to support the channel further than you already do just by watching, liking, subscribing, and all that, please be sure to check out the join button somewhere around the subscribe button. If you click on that, it will let you join the channel membership for as low as $2 a month, and you get special access to emoticons you can use when you comment, and special icons that appear next to your name as well. No content will ever be locked behind the paywall, it's just something extra you can do if you'd like to support the channel further. Without further ado though guys, we'll get right into the stories, and I hope you guys enjoy them. Have a great day. The quick backstory. I've had a stalker for about 4 years now. He was never aggressive or sent me proper threats, so stubborn as I am, I did my best to just ignore him and not give him the satisfaction of showing him any fear. To be honest, after a while, I also wasn't really scared anymore, since he almost never came close to me. I know being stalked can affect people very severely, even in a case like mine, and that's totally valid. I guess I just got lucky because I was never really psychologically affected by it. His stalking behavior mostly just consisted of sending me letters and gifts, such as photos of my own apartment building from the outside, things he'd dug out of my trash can, and so on. I called the police many times, but they weren't able to or even really tried to catch him. About 3 weeks ago, I discovered the German version of IMA. I thought that people might want to know about what it's like to have a stalker, since I barely use any social media aside from Reddit and have no personally identifying information on there. I didn't think he'd ever see it. Like I said, he was never aggressive and had never come close to me. The closest I knew of was when he sent me a picture of myself unlocking my apartment door, taken from the corner of the steps above. I consider myself a very vigilant person. I was thinking he might have hid a camera there, instead of actually being there to take the photo himself. I don't know how he got wind of the AMA, but he did. The next week was quiet, no letters, and I didn't see him anywhere. Then he left me letters with printed out questions and my answers from the AMA. He also left me a long, hateful letter towards my boyfriend about an issue I had posted on a different subreddit. His letters were never hateful like this before, though he never did seem happy with my boyfriend. A few days later, I got a gift. This time, he didn't leave it in my mailbox or at my car like he usually did. This time, he left it inside the apartment building right in front of my door. I didn't take it inside, but opened it outside to be safe. It was a pretty big box. It was taped shut. As I'm typing it out, I realized it wasn't a good idea at all and could have ended very badly for me. Luckily, he didn't decide to send me a bomb or something. What he did send was several zip ties, a roll of tape, a TV remote with most of the buttons picked off, and a pack of band-aids with a few used ones. There was also a framed picture of me. I could tell the picture had been taken just a few days ago. My boyfriend had been next to me, but his face was cut out of the photo. The frame was shattered, and the package was full of glass shards. Clearly more than just what could have fallen out of the frame. They were intentionally placed inside the crumpled newspaper that was stuffed in there to keep it all hidden. I called the police right away and gave it all to them. They were more concerned this time finally, thanks, and told me they'd send patrol cars out more frequently. He didn't show up or leave me any letters for another week and a half, but 8 days ago it started up again. I found letters in my mailbox where he wrote about how he'd wasted all his time on me, how I hadn't been appreciating his effort, how he was wrong about me being special. 5 days ago, I left my apartment in the morning and heard a crunching sound as I stepped on my doormat. He laid broken glass under it during the night. I went off for work because I was in a hurry. I was going to make my boyfriend call the police, but then I noticed my car had been vandalized. The sides were scratched, the lights smashed, and the windshield had a phrase painted on. "It's time soon, miss," my last name. I went back inside and called the cops myself. They found the same phrase written on a note under the doormat. This time, they really took me seriously, which might have just been because I was absolutely pissed at this point, which I made very clear. If for some reason you're like me and too stubborn to be afraid of your stalker, then all this, the letters, gifts, and photos, even the made glass under my doormat, are really just annoying and inconvenient. Now though, with my car useless to me, that threat scared even me. I did have a dash cam on my car luckily, and it caught everything. The police took the footage as evidence, and they told me they'd look into it further. They promised to send more patrol cars out again. Then it was quiet for 2 more days. That was until 2 days ago. Someone rang the doorbell just after 4 a.m. My boyfriend and I got up, but were both hesitant. I saw blue lights outside though. Just as I got up, I heard them shouting, "This is the police. Please open the door." They told us they'd been called by one of our neighbors downstairs, who came home from his night shift an hour earlier and heard someone else enter the building after them before the door fell shut. The neighbor went into his own apartment and looked out through the peephole. We have motion-activated lights in the stairway, so he wanted to see what was going on. He saw a middle-aged man walk upstairs. Above this neighbor were only me and my boyfriend and a single mom with 3 kids, who probably wouldn't be getting any visitors at 3 a.m. They came and found my stalker 1.5 floors above me on the stairs. He should have been able to see the cop car since there was a little window up there, and they had their lights on. I guess he missed them though somehow. They found a pocket knife on him, and he confessed to being my stalker right away. He was finally caught. They got him. It took 4 years, a provocative social media post, and a very vigilant and caring neighbor, but he's finally done. He's facing several charges, and I've collected every single piece of evidence over the past 4 years. I don't know what kind of outcome I can expect, but now I've finally got some peace. Right on the outside of town, there's an old railroad track. At this time, I had lived in this town for about 10 years. I could count on my hands how many times I'd actually seen a train moving on it. However, right after a bridge, there was another off-track. I'm not really sure what you'd call it. There were often train cars parked there for a really long period of time. The area around there was very heavily wooded. There was a road that went through it and up a hill as well. There were a few houses up there, but very spread apart. I would often take that road because it was a shortcut to get back home, and it led to a field as well. That's how I knew about the train cars that were often parked there. I was walking with a friend one day when he decided he wanted to take some pictures of those train cars. He was designing some sort of game, I believe, and felt he needed pictures to model off of. After taking pictures of some of the back cars, he wanted to walk to the ones in front as well. We had been snapping photos for a good 15 minutes at that point. As we started walking forward, though, we noticed something. Someone snuck out from between 2 of the cars and then started to walk in our direction. I can't explain why, but seeing this guy made us both feel very uncomfortable right away. There were rarely any people back in that area. I asked my friend if maybe we should just go now. For some reason, the appearance of the guy who was a bit far from us was making him feel uneasy too. We decided to just leave and come back at a later time. About a week later, he and I went on another walk. We decided to take that back road again. He needed to take some more pictures. Same train was there, but that's not a big surprise. It would sit there for months at a time. We were going to try to go to the front of the train again and take those pictures of the front cars we didn't get last time. As we began walking in that direction, though, it happened again. A guy just came out of nowhere from between 2 of the cars. It could have been the exact same one from the first time. Once again, there was something very creepy feeling about the whole thing. My friend and I decided to just leave again. We talked about it for a while and came to a simple conclusion. There must have been some homeless people sleeping in those cars or something. We figured for that reason he must have been living in between them maybe. Perhaps he just didn't want anyone snooping around his living area. We decided that maybe we'd just stop bothering him and stop trying to get those pictures. We kept away from that train area for quite a while. My friend was really stubborn though, and really wanted those pictures of that train. After a period of time, we decided it had probably been long enough, and we wanted to go back. My friend was taking pictures, going further down the track than we had before. Since the man hadn't come out yet, we figured he'd moved on since then. My friend started going between the cars to get pictures that he needed. This happened so quick that it took me by complete surprise. The man just suddenly pounced out from behind one of the cars, screaming all sorts of gibberish. He was holding what looked like a knife in his hand, and he began to sprint towards my buddy. My friend was closer to the man than I was. He fell over in surprise. The crazy man easily jumped on him and held him down. My friend was struggling to get up. I hate to admit, but I almost ran away in fear. I knew I had to help my friend somehow, though. I ran over there and tried my best to pull this guy off of him. The man was a lot stronger than I'd thought, though. With the combined strength of me and my buddy, we were just barely able to push him off. The guy stumbled backwards and fell down. I tried my best to heave my friend to his feet. By the time he was up, the crazy man was up too. This was the first time I got a look at him. His eyes were chilling to me. They made Norman Bates look normal. His face was covered in blood. It was only then that I realized he'd actually bitten my friend. It was too much. The two of us took off running. The man chased after us with his knife, but fortunately only as far as the end of the train. We were able to get out of there safely from that point on. My friend had been bitten so bad he had to go to the hospital. The police went and arrested the man who attacked us. They found tons of dead animals in the area where he'd been hiding. It looked like he'd been eating some of them. He went to jail for the attack. 3 years for aggravated assault. The two of us, though, were stuck with the memory. I've hesitated to share this story for a long time because I know how important the mutual trust between a resident and their landlord/maintenance staff is. I don't want to instill any unnecessary distrust in anyone's landlord. I've shared stories before about dangerous, scary residents I encountered while working at apartment complexes, but this is a story about the other side of things as a renter. Before I had even graduated from high school, I knew I wanted to live at Paradise Apartments. I was a bit naive at the time, drawn in by the multiple amenities I would never use, but I primarily wanted to live there because the complex was pet-friendly and also within my small budget. When the time eventually came for me to get my own place, I sublet the only apartment they had available and moved in. Unfortunately, I soon came to realize this apartment was not as nice as I'd originally thought it was. The building was old but remodeled, so it had all the typical plumbing issues and extremely thin walls. I also learned it was not the safest part of town either. I was primarily an online student, but I had one class that met in person twice a week, around 8 a.m. or so. I'm a bit of a homebody, so I rarely left during the day, except for that class. Maybe the occasional shopping excursion or to spend some time with my boyfriend in the evening after he got off work. My apartment was a bit of a Bermuda Triangle. Even though it was only 600 square feet and I lived alone, things had a way of growing legs and simply walking away and disappearing. I had 2 kittens at the time and blamed them regularly for all these things going missing. Something odd that kept reoccurring, however, was that I'd find my underwear box out and sitting in the center of my bedroom floor on days when I knew I had class. I didn't have a proper dresser, instead using an IKEA shelf with some IKEA boxes for designated clothes. You know, one for socks, one for pants, one for pajamas, etc. I could have sworn I'd put the underwear box away after getting ready for class, but I simply chalked it up to me forgetting as a result of having to get up so early. Arguably paranoid, I started to think that some of my laundry was disappearing as well. Favorite articles of clothing would go into the laundry hamper and seemingly never come back out. And towards the end of that semester, I was working one evening on a homework assignment when my boyfriend called me to let me know his roommate had accidentally locked him out of their apartment. I had a spare key to their place, so he asked if I could run over real quick and let him in. Before I left, I made a mental note that I had left literally every light in my apartment on. Because I was living on a pretty tight budget, normally I'd make a point of turning off all the lights when I left, but my boyfriend lived like 5 minutes away, so I knew I was going to be back very quickly anyway. Sure enough, I got back less than 15 minutes later. Immediately though, I could sense something was off. I could see the lights were now off through the blinds. I called my boyfriend and he drove over to meet me. We unlocked the door and went inside. The lights had all been turned off. Thinking maybe I'd had a power outage, I flipped the main light, only for it to immediately come on. My boyfriend checked the entire apartment. No one was inside, but someone had definitely gone through and systematically turned off every light, including my lizard's basking light, my laptop as well. We called the emergency maintenance number, and I explained that someone had been inside my apartment. They had to have used a key, because there was no sign of forced entry either. The manager called me back and told me I had to be imagining things. Maybe I'd just forgotten before I left. I assured him I wouldn't have turned off the lizard light to kill my own lizard. Someone had definitely been in my apartment. I was extremely worried because obviously this person had a key to get in. Either they worked for the complex or had been a previous tenant or guest. I asked if they had changed the locks after the previous tenant moved out, and they assured me they changed the locks every time. They then tried to suggest maybe it was a friend pranking me, someone else I had given a key to. Well, the only other people I had given keys to were my boyfriend and my mom, one of which was obviously with me right now. In any case, neither of them would have pranked me in this way anyway. After enough finagling, the manager finally agreed to send someone out to change the lock for my peace of mind. I brought up my concern it was someone on staff, since they would be the only other people with keys. The manager claimed the keys were locked in a special safe that required a personalized code in an office with a security camera as well. They changed the locks, but I had my doubts it would do much good. As far as I was aware, there were only 2 maintenance guys that worked on the complex. One nice older man that didn't seem all that skilled, and a younger guy with a scruffy beard who gave off a very bad vibe. I suspected it was him immediately. When I had first moved in, the manager had told me I would be getting a new kitchen counter within the first 3 days. I waited to move in my kitchen stuff, but after a week they hadn't come. Then after a few months, I had completely forgotten about it. One day, I was sitting in my living room, and this scruffy maintenance guy walked in without knocking or announcing himself. I hadn't received a notice to expect him either. He said he was there to replace my countertop, but it took him 2 days to install one small piece of the counter. A few weeks later, I was getting out of the shower when I heard a single knock at the door. I called out and hurried to get some clothes. Not 2 seconds later, the door started to open and I had to slam it shut, still wrapped in a towel, to stop him from just coming in. He claimed he hadn't heard me, but I had my doubts. Another time, I found a note from him that he had come in while I was gone. Again, no reason given as to why. He made a note about my third cat being cute as well, except I didn't have a third cat there. I did, however, have a picture of my childhood cat in my bedroom on the IKEA shelf where I kept all my clothes. At that point, I went to the office to ask them to make a note in my file that A, I wanted at least 24 hours notice before entry going forward, and B, to always be present when they tried to come in. Now that I knew without a shadow of a doubt that someone was coming in secretly, it all added up together. It hadn't been long after the surprise maintenance visit stopped that things started moving around in my apartment. He was also on site all the time, so he must have known when I would come and go. Who knew how many times he had snuck in, how many small souvenirs he had stolen. He could have been coming in while I was asleep, and I would have never known. After the night with the lights, I put my own lock on the door. I still didn't totally trust the apartment. I ended up buying a condo shortly after, subleased the apartment, and moved. In the final days before I left, my mom came into town to help me move my stuff. While she was home alone, as I was at class, she caught the scruffy maintenance guy trying to get his key to work in my lock. She demanded to know what he was doing, and he said he was there to paint the front door. I didn't receive any notice, and he didn't have any supplies either. She told him he could wait until after I moved out. A few years later, I was shopped by the owner of Paradise Apartments while working at another complex in town. Shopping, by the way, is when an employee from one apartment complex takes a tour at another under the guise of wanting an apartment for the purpose of gaining information they might not easily give up. There were certain tells a shopper always gave. Asking specifically worded questions that required specific answers and were easy to trip up on. Being too wealthy for the complex, being too flexible on what they were interested in. The guy seemed too old and too well off to be considering an apartment at where I worked. Normally, I wouldn't have badmouthed any other complexes. I preferred to win them over by showing them the positives of our community, but I told him I probably wasn't the best person to tell him about Paradise Apartments. I told him about my breaking in, and that I suspected it was someone on the maintenance staff. At that point, he revealed he was now the owner, and was very disturbed to hear I'd had this experience. He asked me to describe the man in detail. I assured him it was all in past and I was over it, but he insisted on calling the manager. He answered that yes, there had been a scruffy young maintenance man he'd had to fire because he'd been caught multiple times breaking into the apartments of single women. Satisfied, the owner proudly told me the issue had been resolved and asked if I would be willing to change my bad review. I told him no. None of this changed the fact I'd experienced this. Actually, it validated everything I expected. In the years I worked as a leasing agent, I learned a lot about where complexes will cut corners to save time. From my experience, a lot don't switch out the locks if the previous tenant was good. A lot didn't require background checks for employees, even though they did for the tenants. And keys also got passed out willy-nilly to maintenance and vendors and basically everyone who worked there. I wouldn't go so far as to say everyone operates this way, but everyone I worked at was doing this when I started there. If you're renting an apartment, be sure to stay diligent. If you have reason to believe someone is coming into your home, document it and let the staff and friends know. You never know who might have a key to your apartment. They seem to give those things out to everyone. If you're in the US, then you know that the weather has been absolutely terrible everywhere lately. Snow in LA, tornadoes in the Midwest, so many storms, and they just keep on coming. And the most recent bout of storms brought with it something I'd never thought to be concerned about. I was home alone because my husband works nights. I already don't like that much, as I hate being home alone at night. I often double-check the door locks, the windows, and jump at just about every noise. If someone else is home, I'm perfectly fine, but when I'm home alone, I get easily scared. Add to that severe thunderstorms, and the threat of tornadoes when I live in a trailer, and you can imagine my anxiety. The rain was pounding on the roof and windows, and was only drowned out by the cracks of thunder that seemed almost constant. I was reading a book to distract myself, when the power suddenly went out. I swore and put down my book. I sat there waiting for a moment, hoping the power would come back on, when the booming thunder made me jump. It rolled for what seemed like ages, as I sat there in my chair in the dark, wondering what I was supposed to do now. As the thunder ended, I noticed the night seemed oddly quiet. The wind, the rain, even the thunder were silent now. Was the storm passing? It seemed to be a bit quick for that, though. I was happy to think my power would be restored quicker if the storm ended sooner. I stood up, thinking to get myself a drink, and perhaps prepare for bed as I had nothing to do now. I used my phone as a flashlight, and was walking toward the kitchen, marveling at the oddly quiet night. That was when I heard something distinctly not a part of the storm. It began low and quiet, and quickly ramped up into a piercing wail. I froze in place. The tornado siren. I didn't stay frozen for long. I ran into my bedroom and hunkered down in my walk-in closet. I didn't feel safe, though. All my life, I'd heard about what tornadoes do to trailer parks, and though I was deep in the closet, I was just imagining a tornado picking up the entire trailer. Me being tucked away in the closet wasn't going to do anything about that. It'd just throw me around. I suddenly realized that though I'd lost power, I hadn't lost everything. I had my phone and decided to actually use it for one thing I rarely use my phone for. I called my husband. I was panicking and barely got out 2 sentences before he said, "Why don't you go to the shelter?" I had completely forgotten our neighbors had a small tornado shelter nearby. They'd mentioned it a few times, and it wasn't all that far away. In my panic, it had completely slipped my mind. My neighbors were only in town on occasion, as their house here was their vacation house. I knew they weren't in town now, though, and expressed this to my husband. He told me they never locked it, though. It was a storm shelter, and they wanted to make sure anyone could get to it in case of an emergency. I hung up and stood to leave the closet. It sounded quiet outside, except for the siren. I quickly went to the door, slipped on my shoes, and went outside. It didn't seem to be raining either. I heard no thunder and saw no lightning, but I could feel it in the air, something very ominous. I turned the flashlight back on my phone and carefully walked down the porch steps. I walked quickly through my neighbor's yard. The shelter was a small structure, partially buried in the ground. As I reached for the door, the wind picked up, and I felt the strangest thing. The rain began again, quickly, but it wasn't normal rain. It wasn't falling like normal. It was completely horizontal. I had heard of this, but experiencing it was something else entirely. I jerked open the door and ran inside, slamming it behind me. It was only upon reaching the bottom of the stairs, soaked from the sudden downpour if you could call it that I realized there was a light on, and I wasn't there alone. For half a second, I expected to see my neighbor there, or even another neighbor of ours using the shelter, as it had been left open for all of us. The shelter was small though, just a single room no bigger than the average bedroom. Across the room, just feet away, lying on the built-in bench against the wall, was a man I'd never seen before. There were items strewn about him on the floor, and I knew he'd been living here for a while. He glared at me from the bench, setting up with the blankets hanging off his head and making him look like some perverse hobo nun. I stood at the foot of the stairs, frozen with uncertainty. A loud rumble of thunder reminded me why I had come down there, though. I forced myself to calm down. I had met homeless people around here before. There was no reason to immediately assume the man was dangerous. After all, he needed a place to stay during a tornado too, and here was an unlocked shelter just waiting to be used. Hi? He just stared at me. I couldn't move from the foot of the stairs. I very much wanted to run back up them and into my house, but the roar from outside kept me from doing so. I was hearing the wind, and it sounded like a freight train. I'd heard it said before, but only now I realized it wasn't just being poetic. It sounded like the roar of an oncoming train, muffled only by the fact I was underground. The man continued to glare at me, a look of utter hatred in his eyes. "Look, I'm sorry to disturb you, but this is a tornado and this is my friend's shelter," I explained. The man suddenly stood up. "This is my house!" he shouted, raising an arm and pointing at nothing. "I know you've been staying here," I began, but he continued shouting, staggering towards me. "It's my house. Mine! Get out!" "There's a tornado out there!" I shouted back, not at all sure where I got the courage from. I was standing at the foot of the stairs, and I could hear the wind behind me. The sounds were stressing the metal. "Get out! Get out!" he shouted over and over again as he staggered toward me. I didn't know what to do. It wasn't like I could leave. There was a tornado going on outside. This man was coming at me, though. My eyes shot around the room for any sort of weapon, but there was nothing within reach. The man was much bigger than me, but his staggering gait made me think for a moment I could take him. He grabbed me with his strong hands, though, and all my pushing had no effect. "Let go of me!" I shouted. He just constantly shrieked, "Get out!" He began trying to drag me up the stairs. He was going to throw me out into the tornado. I punched him hard across the face and screamed, "There's a tornado, you moron!" This only made him more angry as he returned the slap hard. It hurt like why, but I realized he was only holding me with one hand now. I wrenched myself from his grasp and lunged toward the other side of the room. I tripped and fell, but I kept scrambling, trying to grab anything I could use as a weapon. My hand fell on something long and hard. It felt like wood. As he stood over me and reached down to try and pick me up and drag me out again, I swung the object at his head, and completely missed, of course. He wrenched it from my hand and threw it away, then picked me up. He tried to throw me over his shoulder, but I was having none of it. I struggled and kicked, and he had to half carry and half drag me to the door, all the time alternating between muttering "my house" and screaming "get out." I was doing my best to make things difficult for him. I didn't want to be out in this storm. I didn't want to die in a tornado for some crazy man hiding in my friend's shelter. I kicked and screamed, struggled and scratched. One arm was at my chest and the other at my throat. I started to feel like I was choking. He was wearing a filthy shirt and he reeked. For some reason, this is what I thought before I squirmed my way into a position to bite his arm hard. I sank my teeth in as deep as I could. He howled and dropped me. I slid down the stairs, and he shouted and cursed, shaking his arm. As I reached the bottom, I quickly crawled to the far end of the room. I was terrified of what he would do to get back at me for that. I also wanted to be as far away from that door and the tornado as I could get. When I reached the other side of the room and turned around, he hadn't followed me down the stairs, though. Instead, he was standing there staring at me, glowering like he had been before. He was holding his wounded arm in the other hand. Suddenly, he turned, and with the roar of the wind, he opened the door and stepped out into the tornado. I was shocked. I sat on the bench furthest from the stairs and stared up at the now open door. I couldn't see anything but darkness, and the rain was now flowing down the steps. I huddled on the bench in the corner, staying away from the man's belongings. I didn't know if he was dead or if he'd ever be back, but I didn't want to touch them either. The wind and the siren filled the night, and a small waterfall formed on the stairs from the sheer rain. After a few minutes, though, it all died down. I sat there lightly touching my face where he'd slapped me. I realized he could come back and be armed, much angrier as well. I grabbed the wooden object I'd tried to hit him with before. I was surprised. It was a wooden Lucky Cat statue, and it was also mine. Usually it just sat on my front porch, but it had suddenly disappeared a few weeks ago. I thought it had gotten blown away in a previous storm or something. But it hadn't been blown away. The man had taken it. He'd been here for weeks, living in this shelter, mere yards from my house. A chill ran through me as I realized this. Part of me felt bad for him with him being homeless, but that didn't mean he wasn't dangerous. I realized I hadn't locked the door when I left my house to go to the shelter. He could have gone there. I clutched the cat to me and stood up to grab my phone that I now realized I'd dropped during the struggle. I picked it up off the floor and flipped it over, delighted to see it was getting a signal. Not much of one, but it was something. I called my husband and stayed in the shelter until he came home. Thankfully, there were no strange people in our house, which was still in one piece. The tornado had hit nearby, but it was a bit south of us, and thankfully there wasn't much damage. It seemed no one had been hurt. There was no sign of the man, though. I think my neighbors should be locking the shelter from now on. I know I'll feel much less foolish when I triple-check my locks now. You never know who could be out there, just a few steps from your front yard. Hello everyone, my name is Lisa, and here I will tell you my story. I describe it as pretty terrifying, and unfortunately it still affects my life today. You'll understand why soon. Before I begin, I apologize. I'm French and not very good at English. I decided to share it with you because it took place exactly 2 years ago, and I think it can serve to awaken the prudence of some, especially in this period where the days are shortening. To put in context, this happened on October 1st, 2020, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. I was 17 at the moment, and I had just left Île-de-France, near Paris, for a provincial town to continue my studies. As a student, 4 hours by train from my parents, I obviously decided to grab an apartment. The prices were rather unaffordable for me though, so I settled for a new student residence. It was in the heart of a rich residential pavilion, contrasting with my small student residence. Everything was mostly fine. I'd go to school normally. Right from the beginning, the teachers told us that unlike students of other disciplines, we'd have lessons in person, not at a distance. We would be the only ones to be on this part of the campus. In short, the first classes were going pretty well, even though I had trouble fitting in like the others because of the masks and the nasty... There was one black shadow. On Thursdays and Fridays, I finished at 8 p.m., which meant I returned to my little house at around 8:45. As you understand, I was alone on my way to school. On the week of September 21st to 27th, when I went to class in the morning, I met a strangely dressed man 3 times. He was dressed in black, wearing a hood. His face I could not really distinguish. What bothered me when seeing him was that he looked like he didn't fit in with the neighborhood at all. I wasn't really focusing too much on it though. Finally arrived the night of October 1st. As usual, I left the school, but unlike other days, I had to take the tramway about 1 hour later. I'd finally made a friend with who I'd discussed the timing of his bus. As usual, I waited there alone. Once in the tramway, I realized that just at this stop, there was nobody except the driver and I. I decided to sit in the 4-seat squares to make myself comfortable. At the next stop, which was still in the campus area, as I turned my head before the doors automatically closed, my eyes crossed that of a man sitting alone in black. In only half a second, the man rushed to the doors that were closing and entered the train. While the tramway was empty, he sat right in front of me. Intimidated and understanding this situation was quite suspicious, I looked away and out the window. The more time passed by, the more my instinct led me to believe this man had bad intentions. In my head, I began to develop a plan to ensure the person did not follow me when I had to get off. Once the tram arrived at the destination, I decided to leave at the very last moment, just before the doors closed. As I rushed to get out, I heard a cry from behind. I turned my head, only to see the man had wedged his fingers in trying to block the doors. They opened up again, then he began to walk behind me. This time, I was sure I was being followed. As I accelerated my pace, I heard the man do the same behind me. I could even hear his heavy breaths coming closer. It came time for me to pretend to be on the phone to scare him away. That in fact worked at first. Indeed, the man turned around when my phone rang. I later learned it was my friend calling to tell me he'd accidentally gotten on the wrong bus. I made sure he heard. I turned around and saw the man slip something into his hand. At this point, he stopped for a moment, then started to scream into the air and run after me. I was out of breath and rushed into a crossing in the neighboring part. I threw myself into the arms of a random person and shouted, "Great, you came to get me!" At those words, they immediately understood the situation and returned my embrace. Before that, I turned just one last time. The man had suddenly disappeared. Once I was in my room crying, I thought back to that man and realized it was that same person I'd met multiple times earlier this week. I decided the next day to make a statement. During the day, I was called and told the surveillance videos of the tram had revealed the identity of the person. He was a wanted man for second and also armed robbery. Apparently, he found great pleasure in assaulting rich girls to humiliate them before trying to steal them away. That's why he'd prowled in that neighborhood. Made my blood run cold, and I decided to just go home to my parents. Apparently, the man was found 2 weeks later in another city for a young girl in a store. This happened during the summer of 2015. I had just graduated high school, and I still lived in my hometown at that time. I was out with some friends, and it was getting really late in the evening, around 1 a.m. or so. I decided it was around time to head home. First, though, I had to stop by a drugstore close to my house that was 24/7 to pick up some aspirin and snacks. The one I went to was in the same parking lot as a supermarket, which is important. I parked my car as close to the store as possible. It was quite empty, so there were no more than 2 other cars in this giant lot. I was nowhere near either of them. I headed in and grabbed what I came to get very quickly. I just had this overwhelming feeling of dread the whole time, for seemingly no reason. I felt like someone was constantly watching me, but when I looked around, I couldn't see anyone else there. Well, besides me and the cashier. After I had gotten everything I intended to buy, I stalled checking out for a bit. I went aisle by aisle, looking at random things. I thought, just in case, whoever was out there would surely get bored and leave if I took too long looking around. Really though, the whole time I thought I was just being paranoid. I wasn't used to going out so late, so surely that must be it. After about 20 minutes of that wandering around, I paid for my items and left the store. I got to the door and literally bolted to my car, pepper spray in hand. I locked myself in immediately. I turned my head to check the back seat. Just before I was about to breathe a sigh of relief because no one really was there, I heard a sudden tapping on my window. I looked around before I'd left the store near the entrance, and I'd seen that no one was nearby, so how had I not seen whoever was tapping out there? Of course, this really freaked me out. I don't know if this person was Ted Bundy inspired or what, but this was quite an odd occurrence. I looked up to see a very handsome blonde man with slightly long hair and a big cast on his arm. My first instinct was to drive off immediately, but this man was leaning on the front hood part of my car. I didn't want to just run him over and get in trouble or something, so I rolled my window down just an inch. I called out to him and asked him to maybe back up just a bit so I could drive off without hitting him, but no, he stayed glued to my car. The man then asked me if I could help him with directions and to look up an address for him. I really need to go right now, sir. Maybe you can ask the person in the drugstore and they can help. I already went to the supermarket and they said they couldn't do anything. Well, that was a big mistake. I knew that place closed at exactly 8 p.m. There was no way this guy had just been lurking around for 5 whole hours, waiting for some random girl's help. He then went on and on about feeling really tired. If I could just give him some water or food I'd bought since he had no money, that would be a great help. I told him okay and began to reach to my passenger side to grab the chips I had bought. I started to roll the window down slightly, and like I expected, he moved closer to my window. It was all part of my plan though. Now he was off the hood of my car. I slammed on the gas. He chased my car as it started to pull out, and I heard a scraping sound on the side as I pulled away. I didn't drive directly home just in case I was followed. Instead, I drove down the highway for an hour. I was so distraught over what just happened. When I finally got home, the entire side of my car had been scraped from the door almost to the trunk. I'm pretty sure he used a knife or some other sharp object because it was a really rough scrape. Of course, I immediately reported the incident, but they never found that man or heard of any similar incidents in my town. He was watching me the entire time, perhaps from the windows of the store. How else would he have known I'd brought food with me? I think maybe he had hidden behind my car so I couldn't see him when I came out at first. I feel like he was trying to get me before I got in my car, but I was too scared and happened to get in too fast for him to act. When I was a kid, my mom worked as a teacher, and she was very close to a coworker of hers who had a son around my age. I was very close with the son as well. When my mom or her friend would head out for the night, the other would take care of both of us kids. Basically, it meant I spent half my time over there. My friend spent half his time at my house as well. It was perfect and very fun for us kids. We lived in different cities, but since that kind of system had been going on since pretty much forever, I grew up knowing my friend's area just as well as mine. His mom was well aware of that, so that being said, whenever we were going on a walk in their area, she'd let us just wander around. She knew we'd always find our way back to her. My mom was more cautious and always kept an eye on us. She'd walk a distance behind us to make sure she was always able to see us. I wish her friend would have done the same. One day, I had to be around the age of 6 or 7, I believe. I was going on a walk with my friend Marcus and his mom Katie. It was a very sunny day. I was wearing a dress embroidered with flowers and had my blonde long hair let down. I often heard I was a pretty kid even from strangers in the street, and besides making me and my parents somewhat uncomfortable, nothing bad had ever happened. During that walk, Katie was walking ahead of us. and I was chatting and fooling around with Marcus. At some point, he remembered something urgent to tell his mom. At least, something as urgent as can be possible for an 8-year-old boy. He ran right up to her and left me strolling around behind for a couple of minutes, just as it already happened 100 times prior. This time, though, we were circling around this big camping site. We walked by all the big vans and camping cars. One of those vans, I noticed, had its back doors wide open. There was a man, probably in his mid-40s, smoking a cigarette and leaning against the vehicle. The man locked eyes with me as I was approaching, then saw that Katie and Marcus weren't paying much attention to me, as they were already a couple of meters ahead. He grabbed my arm and pulled me in tight to him. I found my body touching against his. I was so startled and weirded out, I couldn't even let out a word. I knew Katie would have heard me if I called for help, but I didn't have a chance to react. He leaned towards me, obviously much taller than I was. He muttered something I couldn't hear, winked at me, and kissed me on the lips. Then he pulled me into the open doors of his van. At this point, I was almost completely inside. If he had pushed me just a bit, I would have fallen right in. At this point, I was too scared to know what to do. Even though I didn't understand what was going on, I knew this was not okay. He put his hands on the doors as if to close the vehicle, and I felt my heart sink. At that exact moment, some man I'd never seen before jogged toward us. He was in his 40s as well, waving hello at me. "Oh, sorry, I lost sight of you for a bit." I was so scared. The man had a very friendly look on his face and was staring at me with great insistence. The van man awkwardly laughed and yanked me out of the car, slamming the door shut. I ran over to Katie as I heard the van take off in a hurry and acted as if nothing had happened. To this day, I've never told the story to anyone, not to Katie or Marcus or to my mom, nobody. I'm 22 years old today. I'm grateful the friendly guy came out of nowhere just to save me. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. I have no idea what emboldened that pedophile. He surely would have abducted me and was strangely okay with just kissing a small kid in public in broad daylight. I'm not even in the mood to add everything he did, but everything thinks the same thing I do. I wish him hell. Alright, here we go. Nearly a year ago now, on Christmas Day, I was at my dad's with some of my siblings. We celebrated Christmas. Then after dinner, my dad headed off to be with his girlfriend at her apartment. Left in the house were my 16-year-old uncle, my 16-year-old brother, me who was 15, and the youngest who was still only a toddler. I woke up early the next morning, the day after Christmas, and sat on the floor beside an outlet on my tablet. Everyone else was still sleeping when I began to hear a banging on the back door. At first, I thought it was my dad coming back, but the banging got louder and went on for far too long. For lack of a better term, I guess I dissociated. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't move until I heard the back door breaking in. I had been paranoid about home invasion due to our area in the city before, but I had no idea what to do in this situation. All I could do was stand there in shock. I put down my tablet slowly and picked up a nearby flashlight. I think my thought process was to attack whoever broke in with it. When the back door gave out, I heard the person quickly go through the downstairs and stomp up the stairs. It seemed he stopped right outside the door of the room I was in. The man opened the door, turned left, turned right, and then saw me sitting there on the floor. Beside the outlet less than 3 feet away from him. He was taller than my dad, wearing a completely black ski mask. He held a big rusty crowbar with a blue handle. He was wide and looked a bit on the older side as well. In that moment, I took a small breath and screamed louder than I ever have before. It must have lasted for a good 20 seconds. Once I screamed, he yelped a bit too, then ran downstairs and out of the house. I went to the top of the staircase after he was already down them and out the hallway. I screamed out for him to please leave. Looking back, I guess asking a house invader to leave is kind of useless, especially when he's already leaving and he'd already broken in. But I'm sure you can imagine I was not thinking at my best in the moment. My screaming woke up my uncle and older brother. I told my older brother what just happened, as he was half awake and extremely confused. I ran downstairs. My uncle had just come up from his room in the basement. I quickly told him someone had broken in and left after I screamed at them. He already had a knife on him and told me to grab one too. I did after making sure the robber had left the house and checking quickly on the toddler, who was somehow sleeping through all of this. My uncle told me to guard the back door and stab anyone who came through, while he checked the area outside. We could find neither hide nor hair of where the robber had gone. I held the knife and stood beside the broken back door, knowing that if he came back, I really couldn't do anything. I'd never fought anyone before, and I was just a child holding a small knife. Thankfully, they didn't try to return. My uncle came back and said they must have had a getaway driver, since there was no way he could have gotten away so fast on foot. None of us had phones, so my older brother called my dad over Instagram on a tablet to tell him what happened. We explained everything. We all sat and waited for my dad. We talked and realized this had likely been very planned. The invader came in when there was no car in the driveway, and after entering, he ran directly upstairs, ignoring all the new Christmas presents, the electronics, an expensive alcohol collection, and even two easy-to-grab game consoles smack dab in the middle of the living room. He went directly for my dad's room, where me and my brother were. My dad collects valuable shoes, and I guess has some expensive watches he keeps in the closet. Only someone who was friends with my dad, who'd been in the house before, would have known about those collections, and known the right place to go as well. When my dad came back, he asked me over and over about how the intruder looked. I told him again and again, while he and my uncle tried to think of which friend it could have been. I was the only one who'd saw the guy, and had been less than 3 feet away from him. I was in direct physical danger from some stranger I'd never met. We didn't call the cops, as the police in our area are known for being less than unhelpful. As Christmas is getting closer again, I'm worried about being back there around the same time that person broke in. I've had a harder time sleeping, and I've been more paranoid as well. I understand I was and am very lucky that I wasn't hurt, and all we got was a broken back door. But honestly, I really hate the person who broke in. I really hope that wherever he is, nobody likes him. This happened to me when I was 13 years old, but I still remember it as clearly as if it just happened today. I had some uncles who were pretty close to me in terms of age. A lot of times in the summer, if I went over to my grandma's house, we would go for rides in the back of a pickup truck. I especially loved doing this at night because it was a very, very creepy ambiance. Back in those days, I was looking for anything that could creep me out to entertain me. This was a bit of an impromptu visit mid-summer. It was really hot outside as I remember, back in the days when we had glass bottles of soda and not plastic ones. I recall this mostly because we were well stocked on bottles of Mountain Dew. My two uncles decided that night that they wanted to go for a drive through the hills. My brother and my cousin were with us, and they wanted to do it too. We loaded up in the pickup truck at nighttime together. My uncles and my older brother were in the cab. My cousin and I were in the bed of the truck. I enjoyed those rides a whole lot. I recall they were always a bit scary. There were no lights on those country roads, so when it got dark, it got real dark. The only light we had was from the headlights of the truck, and being in the bed of it, that didn't do us back there a whole lot of good. My cousin and I were having a lot of fun though. We liked being scared, and we liked scaring each other too. On some level, the two of us were expecting the older boys to try and do something to scare us as well. We kept waiting for the possible jump scare, but that was more in the back of our mind. I really wish I could describe to you what it was like to be riding in the bed of the car like we were in the dark. It's the sort of thing you really miss when you're grown up. Everywhere we go, there are lights everywhere. It's hard to get scared like you used to be. The darkness was so encompassing that night. It felt like we were nearly isolated. Another thing I can think of is that it felt like we were driving through a tunnel, only made of trees and some such. My cousin and I were back there doing our thing, talking about things we thought might scare each other. These were old dirt roads, so my uncle was not driving the truck particularly fast. There were tons of twists and turns, especially the higher up you got into the hills. The truck slowed down a bit as it was about to go around a turn. We weren't going very fast to begin with, but the turn was extremely steep. We grabbed the sides of the truck to brace ourselves as we made the turn. I was very familiar with this area. My uncles had tried to scare us one time by telling us many cars had had accidents right on that turn. In fact, they said some people had recently died going around the bend. I was absolutely sure it was their way of trying to scare us by making us think we'd all die by going off the road. My back was facing the inside, with my hands bracing me on both sides. That was when it happened. I felt something touch my left wrist. I turned and looked at my arm, and was stunned to see what looked like, for a brief moment, a human hand attempting to grab my arm. I pulled my arm away as we passed by. As I mentioned, it was only for a brief moment. I easily snatched my arm back, and then the truck was already around the corner. I quickly moved to the opposite area, where my cousin was sitting. I was confused, but I explained to him what just happened. I don't think he really believed me at first. He knocked on the window and told my uncles to stop. They did this, and we explained to them what just happened as well. We took our flashlights and walked back over to that sharp turn. My uncle took a rifle as well. When we went back, we were unable to find anyone or anything. There was definitely no one anywhere near us. My uncle turned it into an opportunity to scare us a little by suggesting it was the hand of someone who had died while making the turn. Of course, my cousin and I believed him right away. We got back in the truck and took off again. Riding in the bed of that truck was extremely terrifying. My cousin and I wanted to be in the cab, but there wouldn't be room for us. Whatever I had seen, and the stories my uncles told us, combined scared the crap out of us. We were all too eager to get home. I have no idea what that was that night, but it was the scariest moment in my life. I'll never forget this really strange house I lived in when I was a teenager. It wasn't for a very long time, and I was pretty thankful for that. That's because some really weird things went on inside that house. This isn't as much of a narrative as it is an explanation, perhaps. I'm sorry if that sort of thing isn't for you, but let me describe the house we lived in. The most important thing to know is that it was a suburban area. There were loads of other houses around, but they weren't piled on top of each other like they are in urban areas. The house was 3 stories, and it had a basement as well. It wasn't a finished live-in type of basement, though. It was kind of weird, actually. It was very dark, but not really dank. There wasn't a light switch at the top of the steps either. In order to turn the lights on, you had to go all the way down the steps, and there was a bulb on the ceiling with a chain. The staircase was not complete either. It was one of those wooden board ones. In the beginning, I never really had a problem with the basement, actually. We kept some of our things stored down there, plus it was sort of an unofficial playroom for us kids. Our toy box for the younger ones was down there. Most of the time, I wasn't really even in it much, so I didn't really give it much more than a passing thought. The first time I had a weird issue with the basement was something that's kind of hard to describe. One of my younger brothers didn't want to go down there by himself to get something, so he asked me if I could instead. I told him I would go with him, but he refused to go down there, even if he was going to be going with me. I didn't really give that too much thought in the moment. I understood it was easy for kids to be scared of such things. I went down into the basement, again, not really thinking about anything. I turned the light on and went over to the toy box. As I was sorting through it, though, the strangest thing happened. I heard what sounded like someone laughing. I turned around to see if my sister was in the basement, but she wasn't. In fact, I had thought she wasn't even home. Curious, I searched through the entire area. No one was in the basement at all, least of all anybody who could be laughing at me. So, for the first time, I felt a little bit unnerved. It hadn't gotten to a point where it really bothered me much yet, though. A little while later, I did ask my little brother why he didn't want to go into the basement, but he refused to tell me for some reason. He seemed extremely terrified of it, and he was the only one of my siblings who was like that. The others didn't seem to have any problem going down there. My dad was the type to force the kids to face their fears, but I wasn't like that really. I didn't want to torment my brother. So, for a while, if he wanted something down there, I would go get it for him instead. My parents were quite strict about toys going back in the box when we were done with them, so one day I had to go put away my brother's toy. I even remember what toy it was. It was a mad scientist dissect an alien. I had no problem though. I went down to the basement, which was dark and a little bit cold actually. I didn't really think too much about that though. I walked down the steps and reached for the chain to turn on the light. Then I went over to the toy box and put the toy away. While I was standing there, once again I heard someone laughing behind me. This time it really bothered me. I'd very clearly heard it, and I knew no one was in the basement with me. For the first time, I actually felt a little bit scared. I decided to get out as quickly as possible. I went over to the stairs. I turned the light off. I was a little hesitant to do that, and almost just wanted to run up the steps. I didn't though. I took my time walking up the stairs to be careful. Keep in mind, it was very dark in the basement. The steps were just boards, so I could see behind them, and there wasn't a lot of light. I could just barely see, and what I saw was terrifying. I saw a shadow looking at me from behind the steps, then quickly running away to where I couldn't see them anymore. Scared, I ran up the stairs as quickly as I could. I slammed the door and ran into the kitchen. My little brother was there, and I think he realized just how scared I was. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked me. That was nearly as scary as seeing itself. I was really freaked out, and I finally understood why he didn't want to go down there anymore. For the rest of the time my family lived in the house, my little brother refused to go down in the basement. Regardless of what I had seen though, I still had to go down there every now and then. I was the big brother, of course, so it was sort of my job to not be scared. I sure was though, every single time I went down there. My family moved a lot at the time though, so we weren't there for very long. I was extremely glad when we moved away. For some context, I'm a 32-year-old female. This happened to me when I was around 25 or 26. I work full-time as a researcher at a university, which is where these encounters took place. Now, I'm not a professor or anything, and because of my age at the time, I could have easily been mistaken for just another student wandering around campus. On some days, when the weather was nice, I would prefer to spend my lunch hour strolling about the university grounds outside, or sitting underneath a shady tree on a bench. I was enjoying the time I was not just sitting in a cramped corner of a lab somewhere. On one of these days, I was sitting on a bench enjoying the fresh air, and a male student walking by asked if he could sit next to me. I'm pretty shy and kind of an awkward person, so even though I really would have preferred to enjoy my break alone, I said, sure, why not? The guy initiated simple conversation, to which I obliged, but I was careful not to be too forthcoming. He mentioned he had seen which departmental building I came from, which was slightly weird to me. I had never seen this guy before in my life, so why would he take note of me in particular? I pushed the thought from my mind, though. After all, the weather had been quite decent lately, and I had spent nearly all my lunch hours for the past week outside. Perhaps he was just a people watcher. He asked if I was studying within the mentioned department, to which I told him I was not a student. I actually worked there. He told me he was an engineering student, and then followed up with asking me out to coffee sometime. I apologized and told him I would have to decline. We parted ways after that, and I assumed I would never see him again. About a week or two went by. I was spending another lunch hour outside on campus, sitting on a different bench in a corner somewhere. Seemingly out of nowhere, the same guy from before asked if he could sit next to me once again. Admittedly, I can't quite remember what we talked about. My mind was reeling a bit at the chances of this exact same thing happening again. I was rather uncomfortable with having to turn this guy down a second time. Sure enough, he asked me once again if we could go out for coffee sometime. I apologized and told him I had a boyfriend and would not be meeting him anywhere. Again, he left without saying much else after. I was feeling rather anxious now, but it hadn't reached a level where I had to be too concerned about it. A few days later, I had just finished work and was leaving the building to walk to where I had parked my car. The university charged a fortune for parking passes, even if you were employed by them. I had always opted for the free street parking about a 10-minute walk away instead. My walking route would take me down several quiet residential streets with minimal car traffic. Even pedestrian traffic was pretty sparse on the busiest of days. It wasn't until I was about halfway to my car, down one of these quiet back roads, when I noticed someone was walking directly across the street from me, keeping a few paces behind me. I'd only noticed them out of my peripheral vision. I didn't want to flat out turn and stare to let them know I'd noticed them. Besides, it wasn't too uncommon to see someone else walking. I was just trying to be aware of my surroundings when walking the streets alone. I had to make a few turns coming up anyways. The chance they would be going the exact same way as me was very slim. But all the same, he did. He made every single turn I did, still keeping pace directly across from me, a few steps behind. I didn't want to look at whoever this was. I didn't want him to know I was aware of what he was doing. I quickened my pace a bit. I was approaching the first of two busier streets before I would reach my car. His pace quickened to keep exact match with me. That was the moment I began to panic. I was sure he was following me. After that, I started to full-out jog to cross the first of the busier streets. He started to run to keep up behind me and was now on the same side of the street I was. I was nearly to my car, but I had to cross that last busy street and go about 100 meters before I would be there. It was crossing that street that worried me the most. I often had to stop and wait a good minute or so before it was clear enough to do so. If that were the case this time, he would catch up to me easily. Somehow, as if the stars had aligned for me, as soon as I made it running to the busy street, I had a large gap to cross. I booked it as fast as I could, finally turning around once I'd made it through. I wanted to scream at the man who had been pursuing me. It was him. I could have suspected at first, but now it was confirmed. It was that same engineering student I had turned down for coffee those times. "Why are you following me?" I yelled at him from across the busy street. "I just want to talk to you," he yelled back. I didn't even answer him. I mean, the answer was obvious from the start. I was certainly never going to give my time to someone who was following behind me and chased me for an entire kilometer. I kept moving quickly to my car, determined to get the hell out of there. I didn't even care if he saw which one was mine. It seemed he had given up on following me and didn't try to cross the road after, to my relief. I got home and broke down. I mean, worse things have happened to other people, no doubt, and he didn't have the chance to harm me, fortunately, but I was very shaken. I had some anxieties walking to and from work after. It wasn't long before a coworker and I would walk most of the distance back to our cars together. I even changed where I started parking for a time. A few weeks passed by since the incident, and I had not seen that particular guy around campus at all. I had started spending my lunches in the lab instead of outside. Occasionally, I would go to the student center to buy lunch instead. This one particular day, the food court was packed, almost shoulder to shoulder. I was standing in line at a burger stall when I heard a guy trying to get someone's attention through the crowd. I look up. There he is, waving to me, trying to push his way through the mass of people. I panicked. I started to cause a scene and yelled at him to leave me alone. His face dropped as people began to stare at him, and he slinked back into the sea of students. My heart was pounding, and I was shaking. I don't even remember if I ended up actually getting my food after. I went back to work, and from then on I was even more focused on my surroundings than I ever was before. It's been 5 or 6 years since then, and I still do work there. I'm relieved to say I never saw him again after the food court, and I haven't had any other harrowing accounts on campus. I'm diligent about being aware of my surroundings, especially when I have to walk to and from alone. Funniest thing is, the guy never even told me his name, so I couldn't report an incident to the campus police or anything. All in all, I'm just glad I never saw him again. I can only hope he didn't do this to anyone else before or after me. This happened to me and my girlfriend when we were traveling across country. We had to stay in various motels because although she was okay with sleeping in our car, I was never really able to do that. She could just fall asleep with her head on the window at the drop of a hat, but I would be up all night trying my best to get down. We didn't make any reservations or anything like that. We just kinda drove until we got tired and began looking for any motel with a vacancy. Maybe on our third night of our trip, we had a pretty creepy experience with the motel that we found. I could tell right away driving into it that I was not going to like this place very much. We were in a pretty rural area, and this place looked really run down. Still though, I was really exhausted and needed to at least get some sleep. We decided to bite the bullet and spend the night there. We got into our room and began to prepare to get some sleep. Suddenly, the phone began to ring. Figuring that it was just the office calling for some reason, I picked it up and answered. "Your wife's pretty cute," the voice on the other end told me. "I can't wait until I'm sleeping in bed with her." I wanted to say something back, but whoever was on the other end hung up immediately. My girlfriend asked me what happened, and I told her about that strange experience. Maybe I shouldn't have, because it really frightened her. I thought though that if we received another call, she should at least be prepared to know. Not that I was expecting anyone to call back. About 10 minutes later though, the phone rang once again. I decided to answer it, thinking it was likely the same caller from before, and I was right. "Time's running out for you. Soon I'll be there." Then he immediately hung up. We were freaked out by that point, needless to say. Gathering our stuff up, we decided to go check with the office. We told them about the calls, but it was obvious they were not coming from the staff there. I considered it for a moment, because they were really the only ones who should have even known we were in that room, but the voice wasn't even close to sounding like either of them. We asked if they had any idea what was going on, and they were just as confused as we were. We asked if we could change rooms. We figured that maybe someone just knew the number to that particular room and was giving us a hard time or trying to scare us. He put us in another room on the other side of the motel. We went to that room, and at this point we were very tired. I knew it wouldn't take very long for me to get to sleep. However, I didn't even get the chance to. We had only been in the room for a few minutes before the phone began to ring again. My girlfriend and I both immediately got tense. I decided to answer. "You know, changing rooms won't help you hide," the voice on the other side of the phone said. Then, like all the previous times, the phone hung up right away. My girlfriend knew immediately what had just happened. We talked about what we were going to do. I was exhausted, but now we were both on edge. We had no idea if this was just a prank or if someone was actually going to try and do something to us. We also knew at this point there was no way we'd be able to get any sleep. Someone obviously knew the phone numbers to the rooms and was also actually watching us. That's the only way they could have known we'd switched rooms. We decided to just check out and get back on the road. We would find another motel. We gathered our things again and left the room. We both felt very conspicuous walking out of that room. We felt eyes on us, that whoever had called us was now watching us. We decided to put our stuff in the car before going in and telling the clerk we were just going to check out. When we got out to the car though, we were stunned to see that all 4 of our tires had been slashed. We got even more scared. Immediately we went to the clerk and asked him to call the police. We could have brushed off the phone calls as being a prank, even with the switching of rooms, but the tires being cut, that made it so much more real. It really made us believe that someone had been watching us and was intent on hurting us that night. Unfortunately, the police couldn't do very much. There were a lot of guests in that motel, and they couldn't wake every single person up and question them all. The most they could do was poke around a bit and make a report. Our car was taken to a mechanic, and we rode along with the police to get there. It was a really long time before everything was taken care of, and it was an even longer time before I was able to get a good night's sleep. I used to go out and explore the countryside whenever I could. I would do this just as often alone as with someone else. However, I haven't done it at all since an experience I had with a friend of mine. when we were out hiking years ago. Now, to be frank, the first thing I have to let you know is that the two of us were hiking in an area we didn't have any right to be in. This was usually the case when we decided to go for a hike. It was always more fun to explore areas like that than it was to go hiking in places known for nature hiking or whatever. It was cool to possibly be seeing something that most people won't normally get to see, and exciting to think about what we might stumble across. This was a hiking trip I took with my buddy Todd, when we were both still in college. We had a week off for spring and we wanted to do some exploring. So we took a drive to a very rural area we had found online. Driving up into the hills, we found a convenient area to place our car in that we figured would be a safe spot. Then we hiked out into the woods. We had never actually been in this area before, so we had no set agenda of how we were going to explore really. We simply started out completely blind, hiking out through the woods. We were pretty high up in the hills when we set out, and the area we had parked the car in was actually very dark due to the amount of foliage in the area. It might have seemed a bit creepy at first if we wanted to take it that way. Actually though, there wasn't a whole lot that happened in the first few days. That's not to say we didn't see a lot of things or enjoy ourselves though. Just nothing really notable to be scary for someone reading this story. It was on the third night of our trip though that something really strange happened. We had set up our tents and were in them separately. I don't know if Todd had gone to bed yet or not by this point, but I had the impression that he was already fast asleep. I, however, was having a hard time and was staying up reading a book instead. It was around 11 p.m. that night, I believe. All of a sudden, I heard what sounded like a loud and shrill human scream. It cut through the regular sounds of the woods at night and startled me quite a bit. I dropped my book, took my flashlight, and rushed to get outside my tent. When I got there, Todd was working his way out too. I mentioned I thought he was sleeping. He seemed he was because he was slightly out of it. No sooner than he had worked his way out of the tent, we heard yet another scream cut through the night. More prepared for it this time, we were able to tell which direction it had come from. I was also able to discern that it seemed to be a male screaming as well. It seemed to be coming from a bit of a distance away from us. Todd asked what I thought we should do. I told him I had no idea. He suggested maybe we should try and find whoever was screaming and see if we could try and help them out. I agreed, but told him we should bring our knives with us just in case. So, armed with our knives and flashlights, we started out walking in the direction the scream seemed to have come from. I was hoping to hear another sound, regardless of how scary it might be, to try and narrow down where we were supposed to be going. Without any further sounds from the guy we heard screaming, it was really like trying to find a needle in a haystack. We were hesitant to try calling out at first. We had no idea exactly what had been hurting this person and causing them to scream. As we kept fumbling through the woods and trees though, more and more time passed since we'd last heard the person. We realized if we were going to help them out, we would have to hear from them. That meant we had to call out to him, even if it meant risking calling attention to ourselves. I called out a few times. It was terrifying to do so. If this person had been hurt by another human or an animal, we could be drawing that entity to us. We were pretty scared with every noise we heard right after. Unfortunately, we did not get any response, and no matter how hard we kept looking, we weren't able to find any trace of anyone in the dark. Worried that we might get lost after too long, we made the tough decision to go back and try to sleep instead. We would get up early the next morning and go out and see if we could find anything in the daylight, any clue as to what had happened. I don't think either of us managed to sleep the whole night though. There was the constant wondering of what we'd just heard, coupled with the feeling that something bad had just happened. The following morning, we went to go and check around once the sun had lit the entire area up. Todd seemed just as worn down as I had. Really, we didn't talk about anything though. We just went and searched the area as best as we could, now that we could actually see what we were doing. I don't know what we were hoping to find really. I kept fearing we would stumble upon a dead body. Someone had been murdered in some brutal way or something. For some reason, I kept focusing on the idea it was probably a person who had injured the man we'd heard and not an animal. It was Todd that eventually found something. He called me over to have a look. We found an area where there was obviously some sort of struggle. On the surrounding ground, surrounding trees, there was blood everywhere. A huge amount of blood. We looked around a little bit more after seeing that, but not for very long. We were too unnerved by the whole discovery. Instead, we went back to our camp and discussed our next options. We decided the best thing to do was to just hike back to the car and move on from there. I'm not going to go into too much depth about that because nothing really happened on the way back. I mean, we had a general sense of unease the entire time, of course. We were nervous and the slightest sound scared us. It was scary, but nothing else really happened. We gave a detailed report to the police, but no idea if anything ever came of it. We gave them our contact information, but we never heard back from them. Several years ago, I was in the midst of an acrimonious divorce from my then husband, full of crazy allegations and typical angry filings centered around the custody of our child. As with many divorces, friends and colleagues seemed to pick one side or the other. In my case, there was one sort of professional contact who reached out to me after hearing about the divorce, who offered to be a witness for my case. There were some experiences he related that I had previously been unaware of regarding my ex's behavior at networking events. After this initial call, he started to call on a semi-regular basis to make sure I was okay. Mind you, this was not someone I knew well prior to the separation. He was also much older than I was, but claimed to be very experienced with divorce and custody. I figured it was a good idea to be polite and not alienate him. His testimony was really important to my case, per the words of my lawyer. I kept things strictly friendly, but I always got a weird feeling about him. After a few months, he called one day, and that happened to be a day my son was very sick. When I told him I couldn't talk and explained why, he offered to run to the store for me. Honestly, I really appreciated that. After that, though, he kept on dropping by the house uninvited, or would stop by with various gifts for my son. Again, I kept telling myself to simply keep things polite. The divorce was coming soon anyway. I really couldn't afford to make this guy mad. During this time, he had also helped me set up a security camera system my dad had mailed me. At one point, I needed someone to walk my dog, and he had offered to do it. He used and returned a spare key that same day. One evening, he showed up while I was painting and insisted on sticking around to help, even though I was having my starting over catharsis and wanted to do it alone. Just after that day, he came around once again uninvited and unannounced with magazine photos of decor and started carrying on in this manic way about how we could finish decorating the house. I was so weirded out that I made an excuse to leave. I started ignoring his calls altogether and took my son and dog to stay at my parents' for several weeks to avoid another drop-in. I came home a few weeks later, thinking he must have gotten the hint by now. It was a very quiet day. The following morning, I took my son on an outing, something like the zoo, I believe. We both came back quite hot and tired. I put my kid down for a nap in my bed and decided to lay down and close my eyes with him. I woke up maybe an hour or so later. It took me a moment to realize that something was way off here. As I was blinking off the sleep, I realized there was a rose bush sitting on my bedside table. I had most definitely not put that there. There was a post-it note on it as well, something about planting it in the yard. I recognized the handwriting immediately and stood up to go splash some water on my face. I tried to decide whether to simply call my parents or phone the police. As I stepped in my bathroom, I realized the mirror was now covered in post-it notes, all with super creepy messages, love notes and calls of affection. Honestly, it really scared me. I was still waking up and trying to figure out how all this could have possibly gotten into my house in the hour I was asleep. The front door was still definitely locked. As I went from room to room, though, there were notes placed everywhere. I mean thousands of post-it notes covering the walls, in my cabinets. There was even one inside my coffee maker. I started to grab all of them and put them into a big pile. Then I got to one in the kitchen that made my blood run cold. You know, you're really cute when you think no one is watching you. I realized then that there was a security camera pointed right where that note had been left, the one that man had helped me set up months earlier, when I didn't think he was a psychopath. I called my parents in hysterics. I sent them a bunch of photos, and my dad insisted I should not call the police. Remember, this was during a custody battle. He said instead he would drive over and change the locks and put a chain on the door. We also immediately changed the passwords on the cameras, which had been installed to document if my ex tried to break into the house. That was the initial purpose at least. This man had access though, and could apparently see and hear everything going on inside my house for months. The security cameras, I realized, he had copied my passwords when I was setting up the system. The only way I could figure out that he got into my house is he must have made a copy of my house key the day I gave it to him. Because my dog had gotten to know him, he wouldn't have barked to try to warn me either. That scared me the most. I was absolutely horrified. This man had been in my house for a long time. There's no way he could have put up that many notes very quickly. He must have been right next to me, feet away from my son while we were both sleeping, and somehow he thought all this was okay. I left and stayed with my parents again for a few days, afraid of what the guy was going to do when he realized he was now both physically and digitally locked out of my house. When I came home, my son had gone to his dad's for the night. I was home alone, on the phone with another friend from out of town. At about 10 p.m., the man showed up at my door, pounding on it, trying the locks, screaming obscenities and demanding to be let into his house. Gone were all of the niceties. This was someone completely furious and derailed. All I could do was hide in my bedroom until he left an hour later. This was St. Patrick's Day, so I'm sure he'd been drinking as well. After that, there were several other times someone would start knocking on the door in the middle of the night, always when my son wasn't home. He tried reaching out using fake social media accounts as well, always getting blocked. Years later, I discovered he had secretly befriended my mom on Facebook, and therefore was still able to see all of the photos of us she posted or shared. I saw when she left her computer logged on that they were having a conversation about how he could get back into my life. I sold that house 2 years later, still finding new notes even as I was packing up. I'm more than relieved he no longer knows where I live. I don't post photos of my new house online now. I changed all the privacy settings on my social media accounts. I avoid all the places he used to go and the networking events he attends. I stay as under the radar as possible. I could never bring myself to play back the security camera videos. I was already traumatized enough and didn't want to see just how much danger we could have been in. When I was around 15 or so, my mom and stepfather got divorced in a pretty dramatic way. The whole household was turned upside down, and everyone's routines were thrown off. Mom was out doing something most nights after work. My little sister spent more time with her friends, and I became something of a night owl, usually waiting until the wee morning hours to lie down. Our house was a simple one in a rural area. 2 stories with a huge backyard sharing a fence with both a cow pasture and the entrance to these really thick woods. The house had a lot of problems, but I enjoyed taking over the maintenance and gardening work. They gave me something to do when I was feeling depressed at the time. For some perspective, our kitchen windows looked out directly to the fence described above. The left half of it bordered one of the black corners of the big cow pasture, while the right half bordered the entrance to the woods. It had a rather overgrown trailhead on that side, just barely visible from the kitchen window. For the most part, though, all you could really see was overgrown grass and shrubbery, at least 4 or 5 feet high. Perhaps some low-hanging trees of mixed oak and cedar variety. This backdrop added a sort of eerie tranquility to our property, which I appreciated from the very first day we moved in. One night, I took a break from my homework after realizing I'd stayed up way too late on a Thursday night, even for my standards. I went downstairs to make some food, and my dog followed behind me like she always did. There I was making a grilled cheese in the kitchen. While I was at the sink cleaning out the pan for the next batch, I noticed some of the grass from the wood lines start to shuffle around. Now that really startled me at first, but as soon as I began to fixate on it, I saw no more disturbance. We lived in wildlife country at the time, so I figured it was probably a deer, coyote, or a cougar. Unsurprising for the latter, given the farmer who owned the pasture had dozens of cows, and sometimes did not bring them in at night. Strangely enough, though, I began to notice this even more often in the nights following. Always, whenever I was doing dishes after eating, I would look out the window, only to see grass shuffling around, then see nothing further as I fixated on the spot. I was always a fan of scary movies, and I tended to be a jumpy kid already. Each time I did my best to convince myself I wasn't really seeing any sort of pattern. This changed, though, when my dog would start fixating on the woods too, and barking at night. Furthermore, our motion sensor security light began to stay activated sometimes, for hours on end, only switching off when I would go to the kitchen to make my midnight snacks. Eventually, I told my mom all about this, and while she did initially seem concerned, she also pointed out that we did live behind the woods after all, so we should expect animals or occasional homeless squatters nearby our property. If I was really that concerned, I could always just call the police or animal control. I didn't really disagree myself, and for the most part gave the matter no further thought each night forward. One particular night, though, I decided at 1 a.m. spontaneously to take a dip in our hot tub in the backyard. I changed and my dog and I went outside. I climbed into the tub, closed my eyes, and zoned out like usual. I was suddenly whipped out of my trance when I heard a loud crunch, followed by what sounded like someone falling over into some bushes. I stood up immediately and turned around. "Who's there?" No one replied. It was dead silent, and I had the creeps now. I quickly put on my robe and rushed inside. The very next day, I told my neighbor, friend, and at the time crush about this. She thought I was being ridiculous, but nonetheless agreed to go with me to check out that part of the woods to see if there was any evidence of anyone or anything hiding in that direction I'd heard the noise coming from. We stomped through the woods until we got to where we could see the back of my house. We checked under every shrub and blackberry bush, but found nothing. It was probably just a coyote or something, deciding whether or not you would make a good dinner, the neighborhood girl said, smirking. I playfully flipped her off and laughed, quietly relieved there was no creepy person stalking me the previous night. Well, of course, I was wrong about that, because that night as I was making my usual dinner, our security light came on once again. I raced to the back door to see what was up. This time, though, I could barely make out a shadowy 6-foot figure disappearing through the trailhead and into the brush to the right of it. My heart skipped a beat, and my dog, probably sensing my nerves, began to growl furiously. I called out into the night, "Who the fuck's out there? Come out right now!" Of course, there was nothing but silence. After sitting in the dining room for an hour, I figured I must be being paranoid. Maybe I was seeing something subconsciously, afraid of being out in the dark. I called my neighbor back, and she surprisingly didn't call me crazy this time. She told me she would tell her dad about it in the morning. I never saw that sort of thing again, and my neighbor's dad just chalked it up to being a homeless person camping out in the woods. Very most a stalker from one of the houses around ours. Something he explained wouldn't be surprising, as my sister was quite a looker. He thought it would make sense she would have a stalker, as if that was supposed to make me feel better or something. I suppose, though, in the end it did. Months passed by and I forgot about this fairly quickly. That is, until a local news bulletin came out about a sexual predator having been recently apprehended by local police. It was a report from a couple living a few houses down from us, filed about the wife being approached at night by a tall, gaunt man in the evening hours when she was watering her garden boxes. She said he'd suddenly appear from the woodwork, quietly as if trying to sneak up on her. When she noticed him, she demanded his name, but he darted back into the woods. She called the sheriff immediately, unlike me, and a half an hour or so later, the department combed through those woods and apprehended the man, who was hiding underneath a fallen tree nearby. All the report said was that the man claimed he had been living in the woods for months, surviving on snacks stolen from a nearby gas station, and would not give a reason for why he was out there. Supposedly, he was wanted for numerous offenses on minors and vulnerable adults some years prior, whatever those ended up being. Now, years later, I still get uncomfortable looking out into the woods at night, anywhere I may live. Who can blame me? So here's my story. For context, I live away from home for school, while my sister lives at home with our parents. Also, both our rooms face the street and are right next to each other. I have a full-length mirror in my room just opposite the window, so if I look into the mirror, I can see what's outside as well. Around Thanksgiving of 2021, I had just gotten home from school and was relishing my ability to stay up late. So was my sister. After our parents had gone to sleep, I was just laying on my bed watching some YouTube. I had my window blinds wide open, when for some strange reason, I felt the sudden need to look up immediately. My head snapped up to look in the mirror. Outside, I saw someone pop up from below my window. They began to bang on it 3 times, before suddenly sprinting away. I was shaking, on the verge of tears. I ran to my sister's room and explained what just happened. She was shaken up as well, but we chalked it up to just a dumb teenager. Just a few nights later at midnight, though, I see a text from my sister. "Hey, did you hear that? There was somebody in front of my window." I felt that same fear. I took my headphones off and just began to get up when I heard 5 super loud bangs come from my sister's window. I ran over immediately. She looked really shaken. She told me the man ran to the other side of the house, the wall that was right next to my bed. He began to bang on my wall, right where my head would normally be. We were frozen in fear. We didn't catch the guy as he ran away immediately after. We made some theories as to who it was, but neither of us were the type to have any enemies. We did some investigating and also found out there were no teenagers on our street anyway. None of this made sense. Sometimes I feel that same chill in the air and think I hear the banging. I fear turning around and seeing that man's face in the window might not be as rare as many might hope. I'm praying I never have to meet that person again. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.